Hello once again to the RotoBaller YouTube channel. I'm Matt Donnelly, and we are heading into week number 4 of the fantasy football season. So let's kick things off with those must-start and must-sit players at the running back position. We are almost at the point where if the running back is healthy, you're probably putting them in your lineup. Now, you are starting Christian McCaffrey, but outside of that, who can you really trust? I mean, Austin Eckler and Saquon Barkley, they're both still battling to get back in the lineup after suffering injuries. Nick Chubb, he was lost for the season. Derrick Henry and that toe have been outsnapped by Tajay Spears, and it's really turning into a war of attrition out there at this running back position. Raheem Mostert is your overall running back one entering this week, and the biggest knock on him throughout his career is he's never been able to stay healthy, and yet he is the one running back that's probably been the healthiest of them all. Anyway, I digress, so let's get into these starts and sits for week number 4, starting with Alexander Madison of the Minnesota Vikings as they take on the Carolina Panthers. Madison is coming off of his best game to date against the Chargers, in which he ran for 90 yards, and he also added 32 additional yards in the passing game on 25 opportunities. Madison would have likely even had a better game against the Chargers if he hadn't been stopped just short of the goal line. Against Carolina, he should find himself in a very similar situation as the Panthers, through 3 contests, have allowed a ton of yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground while adding another touchdown in the air, or the passing game. So the backs, they've had success against Carolina. If Madison wants to fend off Cam Akers, he is going to need to learn how to secure that ball better after fumbling on a couple occasions, dropping some passes. These are things that simply can't happen. But for right now, I'm going to take that 80% snap rate and I'm going to run with it. Another running back that I'm running with this week is DAndre Pierce versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Josh Jacobs had his best game of the season last week, and so did the Texans running back DAndre Pierce. Well, kinda. Pierce found the end zone, boosting his fantasy production, and he walked away from week number 3 with 14 fantasy points despite only 59 total yards on 17 opportunities. This week, I'm in on Pierce against the Steelers team that did allow Jacobs 80 yards on 20 touches and have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to running backs this season, allowing on average 26.02 fantasy points on a per game basis. Pittsburgh's defense is currently allowing running backs to rush for 131.6 yards per game, which is great news for Pierce, who has been looking to get things going here this season, as he is only averaging 2.5 yards per carry. Another running back that you need to put your faith in this week is Kenneth Walker versus the New York Giants. New York is one of just 7 teams so far this season to allow more than 25 fantasy points per game to the running back position. It probably didn't help that they faced Christian McCaffrey, who went for 85 yards on the ground and a touchdown on 18 attempts, and they also followed that up with 5 more receptions for 34 yards on Thursday Night Football. But as good as Christian McCaffrey's performance was in week number 3, Walker was even better for fantasy, scoring on a couple of occasions there and totaling 156 yards on 21 touches. But maybe the most impressive stat so far this season to back up all this Kenneth Walker hype, he already has 7 carries inside the 5-yard line this season, after the Seahawks only had 10 such carries all of last season. And finally, my last running back you're going to start is Rashawn Johnson versus the Denver Broncos. Chicago, they need to get back to what worked for them last season, and that was establishing the run. Against the Kansas City Chiefs last week, Johnson averaged 4.8 yards per attempt on 11 carries, and Khalil Herbert, on his 7 attempts, he averaged 4.4. Now, after watching what the duo of Raheem Mostert and Devin Achane did to the Broncos defense, I'm all in on Johnson. And if Johnson isn't in your lineup this week, you are doing yourself a serious disservice. We are talking about 285 rushing yards, 90 receiving yards, and 8 total touchdowns. Now, I'm not expecting that to even hit this week, but if we look at previous weeks, the Broncos did allow Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders to average 4.8 yards per attempt on his way to an 87-yard performance there and 2 scores. I did want to find a way to slide Najee Harris versus the Texans and Josh Kelly against the Raiders into my starts this week, but you know what? I don't care how great their matchups are. I'm not going to put you through that, and I'm certainly not going to put myself through that again one more time this week. Now, the running backs that I'm definitely avoiding this week, it starts there in Tennessee with Joe Mixon. there's a couple rules that I typically live by. 1, you don't talk about Fight Club. 2, you start tight ends in fantasy against the Las Vegas Raiders. And 3, never start running backs against the Tennessee Titans. Never. Now, sure, Jerome Ford, he had 18 fantasy points, but don't let that fool you. He just had 18 yards on 10 carries, 51 total yards that game. He was bailed out by a pair of touchdowns. So those numbers are misconstrued here, people. Don't start running backs against the Titans. Another running back you're not starting, it's Breece Hall versus the Kansas City Chiefs. The New York Jets, they are a mess right now. I don't know how else I could put this. They really should be on the phone right now trying to add Kirk Cousins, or heck, even Carson Wentz would be an upgrade right about now. Breece Hall, he's still wrapping up. He's still a couple weeks away from being that one running back, that one player on this Jets team that you can trust in fantasy. And this week, they face the 4th stingiest defensive unit in this Kansas City Chiefs team that has allowed just 273 yards on the ground and a score through 3 weeks. And guess what? They're also only allowing 13.57 fantasy points per game to opposing backs. Fade them. Don't even put them in your lineup, not even as a flex. And finally, the other running back I'm sitting this week is Travis Etienne versus the Atlanta Falcons. Etienne was one of the few bright spots on this Jaguars offense last week, churning out 88 yards on the ground on 19 attempts, adding 50 more yards on 4 receptions. The problem here is that the Falcons defense has been surprisingly stingy when it comes to running backs in fantasy, having allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the position to date and have yet to concede a touchdown. And it's not like teams are taking advantage of them in the air, because the Atlanta Falcons have a very stingy pass defense when it comes to fantasy as well. So here we go. Let's hit the ground running with the Week 4 running back starts and sits, starting with Alexander Madison against the Carolina Panthers. Minnesota's best chance to win this game is to run the ball. DAndre Pierce versus Pittsburgh. Start him. Pierce has struggled on a per-carry basis, but the Steelers' defense is a cure for that. Kenneth Walker is becoming a must-start and faces another favorable matchup this week. Rashawn Johnson, start him. Did you see what the Miami backs did to this Broncos defense? You know what? Start the Miami backs too. You can trust them as well. Sit them. You're sitting Joe Mixon versus the Tennessee Titans. Jerome Ford, he got lucky with those tutties, but he couldn't run the ball all game. Until this Jets offense figures it out, Breece Hall is still a sit, and Kansas City is not the best time to learn on the fly. Travis Etienne is another sit. Look, Atlanta is a top fantasy defense against running backs and wide receivers. So who am I to argue with the data here? Another thing you can't argue with is the RotoBaller YouTube channel. So make sure you are subscribed. Make sure to hit that like button and make sure you tune in for plenty more fantasy analysis.